Hi, are we live? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on automation and algorithms at work, where we are talking about the labor market impact of artificial intelligence. My name is Laura Nursky, and I'm a fellow at Bruegel, where I lead the project on the future of work and inclusive growth. So when we look at the future of work, we cannot ignore the rise of a new kind of production technology that has the potential to completely restructure the way we organize production and transform occupations across the entire distribution of employment. Hailed as a new general-purpose technology, AI can be used for many different kinds of applications that previously depended on human intelligence, human skills, or human judgment. Economists studying the labor market impact of AI generally distinguish between two types of applications. Those applications that automate away existing human tasks, and those applications that generate new labor complementing tasks. So the bad kind of AI are those types of applications that displace workers through excessive automation, that unreasonably monitor and control workers, putting pressure on efficiency wages, or applications that lead to a loss of human skills, a loss of human judgment, and end up de-skilling our workforce. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the good kind of AI, AI applications that generate new labor complementing tasks in activities that were previously just non-existent or not possible without this new technology. Think, for example, about innovations in healthcare and education, where innovations like individualized learning, training programs that are tailored to the individual, or personalized medicine and personalized healthcare are generating new tasks, but are not displacing teachers or nurses or doctors. Instead, they're leading to, they allow these professionals to do their job better, and they are improving social outcomes. Now, left to its own devices, the technological development of AI might not spontaneously evolve in this direction of the good kind of AI. In that case, we need policies and regulation to steer technological development, or specifically the development of AI, in a direction that is labor complementing. Of course, it doesn't stop at the level of R&D. Once these products, AI products, are developed and out on the market, they are adopted by firms and they are implemented in the workplace. So how can employers also make sure that they responsibly adopt and implement AI in such a way that it supports their workers instead of suppress them? And finally, how can policy help guide this implementation? So if the goal is to have an inclusive society and shared prosperity, then policy needs to support both the socially desirable direction of R&D as well as the responsible adoption and implementation in the workplace. So to dive into this topic, I have a diverse set of panelists here with me today, each of whom can shed light on this topic from his or her unique angle. So let me introduce them to you. Here in the room with me, I'm very happy to have Katja Klinova. Welcome, Katja. Katja is the head of the Division on AI, Labor and the Economy at the Partnership on AI, which is a non-profit partnership of academia, industry, and civil society. Joining us online any moment now. I'm not sure if we can see him already, but joining us soon is Will Carter from Google. He's their global AI policy lead. And also joining us online is Brando Benifei. Brando is a member of the European Parliament for the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. He's also a member of the IDA Special Committee on AI, as well as a rapporteur on the AI Act. And finally, you in the audience can join this debate as well. We'll take questions from the audience live. You can just raise your hand and you will be handed a microphone. And the audience online can join by going to Slido, slide.do, and using the code BAMAI, and then I will see your questions on the tablet. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And as Brando Benifei has to leave us at 3:30, we'll have him speak first, and we'll also take just one or two questions for him before he leaves. So Brando, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I know you're very busy, but as a rapporteur on the AI Act in the European Parliament, Do you think the proposal sufficiently addresses these concerns that I just mentioned about the labor market impact of AI? I mean, beyond just discrimination, because we know that is in there, but also impact on wages, working conditions, and employment. Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm sorry that I can be with you only for a very short time. And in fact, I'm on a campaign trail in this moment. We have elections in Italy. I'm not a candidate, but I'm doing a bit of work for the campaign myself. So I'm in between meetings for that. But I really wanted to be here to give you a few inputs on this topic on the AI Act. I think the point that you are focusing on today is very important to the extent that the AIDA committee has discussed a lot and finally approved in its final report, so the special committee on AI, that a specific legislative piece on impact of AI on workplace should be proposed, because it's a fact that the AI Act can impact on these issues only to some extent because of the legal base, because it's a single market legislation. So there is also this request coming from the Parliament of a further specific legislative act on that. For example, there will be for sure about the liability, because the issue of liability is not very much completed in the AI Act, and so also the issues of impact on employment. But I refuse the idea that the AI Act cannot do more about this, not just on discrimination that you mentioned, but also confront on other issues. I mean, this is such an important topic. In these weeks, we have read many stories also on more and more workers all over the world. I've read a report of the New York Times on this, that employees that were forced to install software that monitored the productivity to the extent of having to move their mouse every so often to show that they are working even when they are talking to a colleague or taking a note on paper. And in other cases, we know that there are employees that if they have a day of remote working, they need to accept to be monitored. And the involvement of social partners is very limited. I mean, US, Europe have different situations, different legal frameworks to protect workers. But clearly, there is already a widespread use of AI that needs to be monitored, about productivity, about the HR departments to evaluate employees, to select CVs. I mean, I don't think we should forbid all of this, but we need to be sure that we don't restrict workers' rights and protections while implementing these technologies. As you know, the approach of the AI Act is a scale of risk, and we need to be sure that everything that has a high risk for workers is put into the high risk category. In the text published by the Commission, the reference to workers is limited to recital 36, where it speaks of the risk of discrimination of workers on the basis of gender, race, age, race, sexual preference, amplifying biases potentially already present in companies. So it's therefore indicated that the AI in this area should be considered high risk. This is a good starting point, but we think that other aspects need to be confronted and strengthened. So in my amendments, we demanded that the AI Act should not affect local and European legislation of workers' rights, which seems obvious, but it's not, and in no way affect the protection of fundamental rights, such as the right to collective bargaining. It's this is on paper, should be, again, not so possible in Europe, but the reality tells us that this can happen. Then you know that we are already discussing the Platform Workers Directive, which deals with regulating the adoption of algorithms for platform workers. But in our opinion, the Commission should not exclude a specific regulation for the use of AI in the workplace. I mentioned that earlier, and we are trying to connect the Platform Workers Directive to the provisions in the AI Act to protect collective bargaining, to protect the existing national legislation, so that we are not putting a limit with the AI Act, but a basis, a minimum protection that we, as you know, are, especially for high-risk AI, we are looking at the quality of data sets. You know that there are, for example, on the selection of employees, the use of biased data sets have huge implications, and also the control through the monitoring of productivity without the work of the social partners will lead to a downward spiral on rights and wages, because it clearly creates an imbalance between employers and employees. So this is creating a situation of vulnerability that needs to be tackled with this approach. So one final issue that is broader but impacts also on workers and workers' rights and use of AI on the workplace, it's impact assessment for fundamental rights as an obligation for all users, so companies that use AI. This is something that we are proposing. We will need to negotiate on. It's a big, innovation compared to the proposal of the Commission, but this could have a good impact also on the assessment of the risks for concrete risks for workers. Also, I cannot avoid to mention, to conclude, that we have chosen to forbid some uses. Some of them are impacting also on workplaces. For example, the forbidden of the usage of surveillance cameras powered by AI through facial recognition. So biometric recognition for surveillance is forbidden already in the text for public places, but we are extending it so that we are sure that it cannot be used also in the context of the workplaces. So thank you. I hope I gave you a few insights on what we are doing on this. Much is under negotiation still. As I said, we are now working on compromises and then in Parliament, and then we will have to negotiate the text of the Parliament with the governments. So we still have a long way to go.
Thank you very much, Brando. I agree with you completely on the need to involve the social partners, and I hope we can touch upon that later on in the discussion. Also, very exciting to hear about the upcoming negotiations and see where they are going. But before you have to leave us, I want to leave the opportunity for one or two questions for you before you go. So I would like to see in the room if anybody wants to ask a question. Yes, there's Duigu who has a question. Can we maybe get a microphone to her?
Thank you. Working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Duygu Güner, Brüchel. I have a quick question on something you mentioned. You were mentioning that the need for a special legislation on the impact of an AI on labor markets. And there I have a bit of concern because we know the technologies we use are changing very drastically and in ways we cannot really foresee. So it is very exponentially changing the way we use technology in our lives. And I was wondering whether Europe is in general very agile and quick when responding to crises like COVID or energy prices, but this is a more continuous process. So it's not a one-time shock that we will just respond, but something that needs to be responded on a continuous basis. So I was wondering whether this is really something the European institutions can have the capacity for. But also, if not, the alternative is to see the outcome and then to act. But most likely, the technological change, I agree. So it's going to be very visible in service sector, which employs 2/3 of the whole workforce. So the effects are going to be more drastic than on manufacturing. It's going to be quicker and will affect majority of the population. So an alternative could be to be more involved in the design of AI in the first place. We know US and China are more involved in that, but EU, maybe not so much. And I was wondering, what do you think, whether we have the institutional capacity and financial resources to really be there on the design stage rather than to act afterwards? Thank you.
Thank you, Duygu. Brando, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, it's a very big question. It could take a long time, but I will try to be very synthetic. For sure, AI Act, not only on the legislative side, I mentioned the liability, I mentioned the workplace possibility of having a further legislation. AI Act will not cover everything. And in fact, the last point that was mentioned is crucial, and it cannot be solved just with the AI Act. That is the need to strengthen a circuit of investment, of development, of research, of a stronger AI ecosystem in Europe, which will depend on many factors. Good legislation, but also other infrastructures that need to be put in place. So I agree that we need to develop that, but for example, we need to strengthen our research capacity and also the capacity to raise capital, so more venture capital on that. But I mean, it would take a long time to talk about this, just I made a few references, but yes, that's very important. Then I need to clarify one thing, that we are creating an AI Act that is trying to have a 75% of AI systems that will be only slightly regulated. The idea is that the less risky AI will be less regulated, because we want this to be developed and we take we can say some extra risk that we need the market surveillance authorities to find out if there are problems. But this is for those that don't deal with human rights, with citizen rights, with health, with freedom, with political rights. So if you look at the categories we consider high risk, we try to cover all the vulnerable groups and everything that can impact fundamentally the lives of citizens. The reason why we cannot just say we let things go and then we repair the things later is that because we cannot accept in Europe that we have again cases like the one we all know about, of the very easy example of the story that happened in the Netherlands with the algorithm of the social security, so that we had children taken away from their families and social benefits removed due to a faulty algorithm. That led to half a government to resign. But in the meantime, after a long legal battle, the lives of many families were destroyed because of a faulty algorithm. We don't want to live in that society in Europe. So that's why we are putting rules so that when you deal with fundamental issues regarding the lives of people and their families, there are extra care, there is extra control. And also this means also the workplace, the impact on workers in the context I explained earlier. So I generally agree with the observations made by the person speaking and asking me to comment, but I also want to underline that we are trying to strike a balance between an open development of AI, that I think it's crucial. We cannot just over-regulate, but at the same time identifying areas where the need for regulation is needed if we want to have our European model based on a strong protection of citizens' rights.
Thank you very much, Brando. Thanks again for joining us, and I know you have to leave us soon, but I'm very happy to have had you in the panel. So now I'd like to
Thank you.
Thank you. Like to move on to our two other panelists here today. Before I do that, I want to remind our online audience that they can submit questions on Slido, slido using the code BAMAI. So after our two final panelists have spoken, I will take some questions from the audience. So, Katja, you've been very patiently waiting. Thank you. So, Katja, some scholars argue that AI innovation tends to focus excessively on automation and driving down wages instead of enhancing human labor. So, in your work, you focus on designing mechanisms for steering AI progress in such a labor complementing direction. So, can you please enlighten us a bit? How exactly should policy do that and steer AI towards an inclusive economic future?
Laura, thank you so much for posing this question, and thanks to everyone who is joining us to discuss it. I actually think it doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. And you would think, well, but isn't future of work topic really top of mind at many conferences, many panels? But when you start examining it, a lot of the conversations focus, as we were discussing with you before this panel, on the labor supply side of intervention. So we're talking about very important topics like upskilling, savings accounts to support upskilling, maybe universal basic income, expanding social safety nets. But what about interventions that target technology itself and what it does to labor demand, whether it overall lowers labor demand, where it lowers it for particular segments of the labor market, and especially worrying about the economically vulnerable segments there. So this is what I want to talk to you all about, and this is what I mean by steering AI towards this more inclusive economic growth, towards shared prosperity. And we should distinguish two types of steering. The proactive steering, the type we do, for example, when we decide as society that we want to be guiding our, for example, energy technology choices towards greener options and not fossil fuels. And we know that the market is not going to do that for us sort of automatically, even though we, of course, should try to deploy as many market mechanisms on that as well. So that's the proactive side. But there is, and the proactive side when it comes to AI, by and large, is not happening yet, at least not until the AI Act comes into force, assuming that there will be changes to it around that, which I was really heartened to hear Brando talk about. But then the passive steering of AI has been happening for a while, and it's happening mostly under the radar, which is not a very good thing because we're not really tracking its impact. And here what I mean is policies which we normally do not talk about when we talk about AI, that set incentives for the technology developers as they enter the market. And that's number one policy there would be tax policy and the ratio of tax rates to labor versus capital. And it's especially relevant in the US context, but really across the OECD, we're taxing labor much more heavily than capital. And so even with some lousy robots that are a lot less productive than humans, it might be still profitable to invest in automation when you take taxes into account. Another really relevant policy here is immigration policy. Very restrictive immigration policy is going to encourage more automation, potentially excessive automation. And there are some few others which we can come back to because there is really a lot to unpack in this passive setting up incentives that innovators face. But now, when it comes to active steering, what could we do if we decided to engage in it? And we keep hearing about the creating technology that complements workers as opposed to displaces them. And this is a very intuitive suggestion that completely makes sense. A worker who is complemented with technology would be more productive, more valuable to the labor market, all else equal, is paid better. A worker who is displaced by technology is paid nothing. So it's reasonable to want more of that complementary kind of technology. And it's so caught on that you'll see that a lot of companies that develop automation technology actually started to describe themselves exclusively with augmentation language. And they can do that because actually in practice, it's very often really hard to tell apart which technologies complement labor, which technologies displace it. And when you are seeing someone or hearing someone pitch to you a technology that helps assist workers really augmenting, you should be asking whose labor is it augmenting and for how long? Because very often, the same technology might be augmenting labor of, for example, higher paid workers, managers, and displacing labor of lower paid workers, their executive assistants at the same time. Or a technology that genuinely assists workers, helps them by, for example, monitoring their every move, every click, and suggesting them the right tips at the right time, is gathering data to automate their labor more fully tomorrow. So this is an augmentation for how long till it becomes automation. And then to complicate it just a little bit more, if that's not yet enough, we of course wouldn't want with policy measures to just blanket discourage all kinds of automation and blanket encourage all kinds of augmentation, because not every augmentation is necessarily desirable. Laura was already talking about the kinds that enable total and complete surveillance and really the shift of power in the workplace away from workers, kind of digitizing all of their know-how into models that they don't hold any IP for. But also similarly, not all kinds of automation is to be discouraged. Automation very well might be raising productivity, might be making it cheaper to produce goods and services, but the question is, do these cost savings propagate, get passed on to consumers as lower prices, or do they get concentrated as higher profits for a few monopolists? Right? So the point I'm driving towards is when we are looking at which applications of AI are desirable and should be encouraged, or not so desirable should be discouraged with policy levers, we need to be thinking not just about direct effects, but also indirect effects, this overall, in economics speak, equilibrium effects. So not just on the target segment of workers, but also on other segments, not only now, but also tomorrow, potentially, to the extent that we can. And we need to learn to anticipate these total effects, which is, if it seems like a daunting task to you, if it sounds like a daunting task, it is. But we've been doing this in other contexts already. For example, we don't get satisfied if an organization tells us that they're doing their absolute best to be environmentally friendly. We don't get settled on that. We really try to measure environmental footprint, even though it's pretty hard. So here, it's a pretty similar problem in this sense. It is hard to measure labor market impact, but in order to inform steering and make it happen with our eyes open, we need to start learning how to do that. We've been working on this at the Partnership on AI under the guidance of a multidisciplinary steering committee, but of course, we cannot succeed alone, especially at getting these measurement adopted industry-wise, and this is where policy encouragement is really, really important. So let me stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Katja, for your enlightening comments. I'm going to remember that it's hard to measure labor market impact, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to learn how to do it. So I hope we're going to open the discussion after the last speaker, which is Will Carter. Welcome, Will. Will is a global AI policy lead at Google. Thank you for joining us online. So Will, if I may ask you, as Google's global AI policy lead, you lead Google's internal policies on responsible AI. So I read your AI principles, and the very first one reads, AI should be socially beneficial. So I can imagine that also includes labor market outcomes. So I was wondering if I could ask you, how does Google exactly define socially beneficial? And how do you measure the social impact of your AI products?
It's a great question, and thank you so much for having me today. I think when we think about the role of the AI principles in responsible AI and more generally in labor market impacts, I think it's not only about being socially beneficial, but also about our AI principle of AI being accountable to people. So how do AI systems interact with people, whether in the workplace or in other parts of their lives? What are the impacts of AI on those individuals? And how do we think about the overall role that AI, automated or not, plays in society as a whole? I think there are a couple of pieces to this, and really, in many ways, I think it actually intersects with the broader conversation about responsible AI. When we think about an issue like transparency or bias, these are very much things that influence the impact that an AI system will have in the workplace, but also it impacts the role that a human has in working with that AI system. A human has to know that the system that they're interacting with is resilient, is reliable, will make decisions that they can trust and count on. They have to understand how it works. They have to understand what it does well and what it doesn't do well. They have to understand what their role is in interacting with the system and how to get the best outcomes for them, for their customers, for their users. And really, that comes down to a lot of design choices that go into your AI system. And so that's really where I think it also intersects with that principle of being accountable to people. It's what is the information that we need as the designers of an AI system to understand how it's going to be used, how it fits into a workplace where there are a wide variety of tasks being performed by a wide variety of different workers. It comes down to how do we communicate information about the AI system, how it works, what it excels at, how people can get the most value from it to those users, to their managers, to their customers. To really ensure that those benefits both are maximized, but also are really equitably distributed. And lastly, I think that, Katya talked about the fact that this debate often focuses on the labor supply side of the equation. And I agree, we miss out a lot on the opportunity to talk about how the technology itself can be designed in a way that maximizes positive impacts, both for the labor market and for society more generally. But I do think that supply side is also really important. And so figuring out how we support workers in transition, how we facilitate upskilling and reskilling for workers whose jobs do change or are displaced, supporting education programs that allow people to understand technology and work with it effectively also is critically important. So while I completely agree, we also have to think about the technology itself and how to make sure that technology is designed in a way that leads to good labor market outcomes. I do think that from a policy perspective, one of the really important things that policymakers can do is help workers to manage the transitions that occur as technology changes the workplace. And really, a lot of what we see is not a wholesale displacement of many jobs. A lot of what we see is changes in the way that work gets done. And part of that is the fact that, we often talk about AI systems as if they're these omnipotent, super autonomous systems. But the reality is that they require a lot of guidance and a lot of support. AI technology has come a long way, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, but it still remains very limited. It needs guidance, it needs human oversight, it needs human augmentation. We talk often about how technology augments human labor, but we also need to talk about how humans augment technology and its capabilities, make up for some of its deficiencies, and really ensure that it can actually have a positive benefit on society. And so, I think all these elements have to come together. And when we think about it from a policy perspective, I think there are a few key things that we can do. The first is to have smart and thoughtful AI regulation. And this is policies, for example, like the EU AI Act, that ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, we have the right transparency measures in place, that we are controlling risks, ensuring that there is resilience built into systems, that they're reliable, that they're not biased. But also that we have the transparency that we need to ensure that workers can be augmented, that they can interact with AI effectively, and that they can add value to their industries and to their jobs. But there's also that supply side, supporting workers in transition, providing education support for people to do upskilling and reskilling, and to understand how we can channel labor into new occupations as many of the rote tasks are automated in the workplace, and give them the opportunity to do higher value add, and more creative work. And I think that it's about balancing both sides of this equation. And really that's something that we care quite a lot about at Google, and also something that I think is really central for policymakers, and something that clearly comes through in the policy debate, whether it's on the EU AI Act or on broader programs related to education skills in the labor market.
Thank you, Will. So thanks for your comments. I think it's interesting how you referred from the principle on socially beneficial towards accountability to people. So I guess in the end, it's the people then who use the AI who should determine if it's socially beneficial or not. And I think that's the discussion that we need to have as a society. So I'm hoping we can start this discussion now. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience and online. So let's first see if we have any questions in the audience. Also, my iPad is not working. Alma, can you see if it's... Is there any questions in the audience for Will or Katja? Yes, David.
Yeah, it's working. Hi, I'm David, and I had the pleasure to meet some of our panelists, either online or face-to-face. I know it was mentioned already that indeed maybe the focus is too much on the labor shortage, and both of you mentioned that whilst that's the case, both of your organizations are investing in that policy side and that angle of reskilling people. But in all transparency, as somebody who's working at the sort of a grassroots level with an NGO dealing with employment globally in 16 countries, AI is displacing people from jobs, and automation is creating, it's part of the issues regarding unemployment in many sectors, especially those to do with physical labor, repetitive tasks. And I wonder, knowing that AI is such a force for good otherwise, which I strongly believe in, why there's not much more innovation and investments happening in using AI to augment some of the skills people have, and not just to augment, but to guide them in their careers. Because what I see also is that many people who, let's say, are a bank clerk who has to be reskilled into a cybersecurity analyst, they just know that that's a possibility. They just don't realize that there's such a perspective. And I can see AI playing a role in that, putting the data together to see what somebody with such skills as a bank teller can do maybe in a cybersecurity role. So my question to both of you is, what more can be done in this area of showing people what they can do using AI, and also then helping them in that process of reskilling in that new industry or career? Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let's maybe collect one more question from the room. Yes, Doigu.
Hello again.
Yes.
Okay. So we were talking about a lot labor augmenting and labor replacing, but maybe a third thing we need to talk is telecommuting. So most of the jobs in service now, thanks to technological changes and COVID experiment, now we can do remotely, and remotely can be also in another country. So in that sense, this probably will lead migration of service jobs to developing countries where labor wages are very low, but the human capital might be equally beneficial. So this, in that sense, in developed economies, this would create a big polarization in the labor market. Those who can take advantage of reskilling would be finding new opportunities, but for those who cannot really upskill, reskill, will be probably worse off. But then in emerging economies, this like manufacturing had made in decades ago, it will create a convergence of wealth between developed economies and developing countries. So in that sense, something which is not really beneficial for us in the developed world could be globally socially beneficial. So what do we do? How do we feel about it? Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so we'll take a round of these two questions, and then I'll take the questions from Slido. So Katja, do you want to go first? You can choose to answer both of them or one of them.
I think these questions actually complement each other so nicely. And David, thank you for your question and acknowledging the global impacts, right, which are happening. And they are under research a lot of the times. There is a lot of conversation happening about impacts that might go through the channel of reshoring manufacturing that was previously outsourced, and we actually haven't been seeing too much of that. Now, maybe with kind of like nationalization of production and protecting supply chains in that way, we'll see more of it, but that's not necessarily because of AI. But there are other channels which previously we haven't seen, and this is due to borderless nature of technology. So a lot of AI development is concentrated geographically and happens in societies where there are labor shortages, either due to other reasons. Those are also geographies with very restrictive immigration policies oftentimes. But once the technology is developed there and the investment is made, fixed cost is paid, then the marginal cost of deploying it everywhere in the world is zero or near zero, and workers around the world cannot compete with that kind of automation. And then you fly to a country like South Africa, for example, where the unemployment stood at the rate of 29% before the pandemic, and you walked into a restaurant and you would see a self-check-in kiosk, and you would be asking yourself, why did a formal sector job get automated here? And that's because the technology was developed in California, where it made economic sense due to these distorted incentives and distorted labor supply compared to the global picture. So we need to be thinking, and to your question of like, why is this happening and why more of augmenting technology doesn't get developed? Because the incentives very much are on the side of this automation now in the countries which overwhelmingly, which dominate AI production. So a call to policymakers in those geographies to put on a global hat and think about the displacement that can happen outside of their borders, which can still come back home as political issues when people start migrating, seeking economic opportunity because it just got so dire at home. And then how do we encourage more of innovation that would help in the education sector? And the education sector, actually, this perfect application where augmentation could be possible, because there's a scarcity of teachers, professors all over the world. There is a scarcity of ability to teach students at the right level, where they are, and help them in a personalized way with exactly what they're experiencing difficulty with, to guide them to what's the most proximate career transition. But again, public sector investment into this would be really helpful. And some of it could probably happen naturally as we start to correct some of the false scarcities that we created, incentives to economize on, like labor in the world. That's not a real scarcity right now globally. And then innovation is going to start being channeled into real scarcities around healthcare, education, green technology, and that's my hope. And then moving on to the question of telecommuting, this is actually, in some sense, just like a chance, to bring opportunity globally, and which I believe would be in the best interest of everyone. Also, domestic, populations within the rich countries as well, because more stable, economically inclusive global world would support this prosperity and stability for everyone. You're right, though, that it might still be polarizing in the emerging economies, depending on who has access to these jobs and who doesn't have access. But we need to be encouraging that, I think, as much as we can, this expansion, and seeing how these jobs transitions can be made so more people get access to these telecommuting jobs in the service industries.
Thank you, Katja. Will, would you like to respond to any of these questions that were raised?
Yes, thank you. And first off, I'll say I completely agree with Katja on the points that she raised. I think on the point about using AI to enable reskilling, enable people to access education, find new opportunities, the point that Katja made about the ability of AI to augment and supplement our very limited educational workforce is a really important one. And particularly that opportunity for AI to help to provide personalized experiences, to meet people where they are in their education and their need for education is really important. But I think that there's another piece to this as well, which is we have an opportunity to use technology to also lower barriers to entry into new jobs and new fields, to figure out how do we actually make it easier for workers to move into a new job, create an interface that makes sense to them, help to automate some of the basic processes and rote processes that are part of the job so that they can come in and bring their creativity and critical thinking to bear without necessarily having to overcome significant skills gaps in some of those basic tasks that make up part of the job. And so to me, there's these two pieces of how do we use technology to make jobs easier for people to understand, allow them to focus on those really kind of high value add and more transferable skills like critical thinking, like creativity, and bring those into the job and the task. As well as to use AI technologies to help them to educate, to learn new things, to learn new skills, to build those critical thinking abilities, to build that creativity through education. On the point about the international impact, I agree with Katya. I think that there is this risk of uneven distribution of the benefits of telecommuting jobs and remote work around the world. I think not only is there the question of how will it impact workers in the developing world and their ability to access these jobs that are being created, but also what's the impact on workers in developed economies whose jobs are being sent overseas to workers who are able to provide the same service at lower cost. But at the end of the day, I agree with Katya. I think it's a trend that we're not likely to see go away. And it's one that I think long-term will lead to more opportunity and more equity among workers around the world. But it's about managing that transition and making sure that that we're distributing the benefits of these changes equitably and in a way that's beneficial to everyone. And that comes down to a lot of things. The classics, trade and tax policy, for example, as well as education and skills, access to infrastructure to facilitate remote work. And things like that. And so really there's, I think, quite a lot of a broad base of policy work that needs to be done that not only touches on technology and technology policy, but really on much broader questions of trade policy, infrastructure policy, et cetera. So.
Great, thank you both. So we agree that we need a global approach to AI to manage the distributional impact of this transition. I'm going to take a few questions from our online audience. There's two that are quite complementary by Mia and Tom. So they are asking about ex-post and ex-ante impact. So Mia asks, harm for workers may only manifest after an AI system is implemented. What mechanisms are in place or envisaged that enable workers to contest AI systems ex-post? While Tom kind of asks the opposite question, he asks, many examples were raised of how policies can help the negative impact of AI ex-post through reskilling. What are some examples of what Google does ex-ante in design? Katya, do you want to talk about this trade-off between ex-ante and ex-post?
Yeah, to Mia's question, and I'll defer to Will to tackle Tom's question. But to Mia's question, I think she is right to point out that sometimes exposed, there is not very much at the moment that workers can do. And we should be creating mechanisms for them to be able to do more. And through union negotiations, through being able to revisit some of these technological decisions, and actually to the point of ex-ante, bringing workers into the decision tables when decisions around which technologies to bring in and how are made. And there's actually a lot of economic value to be unlocked through that process for the firm as well, because workers are the primary experts on their jobs, on where their jobs are difficult, slow them down unnecessarily, could be made more efficient. And if workers are not brought into these conversations, all of these opportunities can be missed out on. But yeah, indeed, as of right now, the situation is not very good in terms of what can be done ex post once that system is already in place and the company paid the money to purchase it and introduce it.
Great. Will, I'm gonna ask you to answer Tom's question about what Google does ex ante in design, and actually there's another question for you, so I'm gonna group that together. Sophia asks William, coming from a US-based reality, how do you see the role of the EU in AI legislation as a global leader or a creator of hurdles or somewhere in between?
All right, so I'll start off with the first two questions and then get to the third in just a moment. I think first off, I agree with Katja that there are limited opportunities for workers to provide feedback and to contest AI systems ex post within their workplace. But I do think that there are things that you can do in technology design that enable you to gather feedback, to flag potential issues that are identified with the performance of the AI system, to more effectively manage risk throughout the life cycle of an AI system, and to do continuous and ongoing monitoring so that you can actually proactively identify when the system is not performing as intended or when it's having bad interactions with users, and you can actually make changes to address that in the design of the system. That, as a technology company, we can't necessarily directly address all of the interactions between workers, their managers, and the leadership of their companies in the way that the AI systems are incorporated into their work. But we can take a lot of steps to make sure that we're actually continuing to evaluate the impact of the system and its performance throughout its life cycle, and make sure that where there are things that we can do in the design of the product or in the way that it's operated by the user and it interacts with the user, we can do as much as we can to make sure that that's a beneficial and positive interaction, and that we're having positive user journeys. But all of that said, as Katja mentioned, there is a lot more that happens outside of the realm of the technology itself that I do think there's a really important role for policymakers to play in figuring out how workers interact with their businesses, with their managers, with their leadership around decisions around how AI is incorporated into the workplace. At the same time, we talked about ex post. Ex ante, it's also really important to make sure you understand how a system is intended to be used, how workers will interact with it, what workers want from a technology that could be incorporated into their workplace. And there's a couple of pieces to this. The one really important piece is, one of Google's core beliefs is it's really important to understand your users, understand their desires, understand the way that they want to interact with technology and incorporate that into design. And a big part of that is making sure that you have inclusive design practices that allow you to interact directly with the communities that you're trying to serve, to gather their input and their feedback as you go through the design process, both as you think about how you scope the problem that you're trying to solve, as well as what are the actual specific features of the product that you're designing in order to solve that problem. The workplace is no different from many other contexts in which our users interact with Google products. We need to understand what workers want, what managers want, how we design technology that meets both of their needs, and also make sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to lead to positive experiences, both for those workers and for their managers, as well as for their customers and their users, and really amplifies the work that they're doing, improves their own products and their own services. And so to me, inclusive design is really one of the key elements of this, and making sure that you have that communication and you have that input and that buy-in up front, and that's critical. On the third question on the role of the EU, in some ways, that's a question that we don't have an answer to yet. The AI Act is not finalized. The liability directive is not finalized. There are some elements like DSA and DMA that are now in place, and that I do think raise some significant challenges for companies around the world. But I think that, to me, there's a real opportunity for Europe to blaze a path forward for responsible and thoughtful AI policy, and help us to shape it in a positive direction. And, you know, I see that reflected in the Commission's draft of the AI Act, which really does try to balance the need for innovation with the desire to manage risk. It takes a risk-based approach. You know, it's proportional. It's very thoughtful about making sure that actual mitigations can be tailored effectively to manage risk in a way that actually is beneficial, rather than having really broad blanket requirements that are not necessarily appropriate to all contexts and all technologies. It considers the intersection of use case, technology, and application in both evaluating risk and understanding how to mitigate that risk. And I think that that's really important. But a lot still remains to be figured out. I think the truth is the AI Act could end up being a really powerful force for normalizing responsible practices across the AI industry and really managing risk effectively, or it could end up creating a lot of friction, adding a lot of cost, and being an impediment to innovation. But I'm really hopeful, and I think that, you know, in my conversations with policymakers in the EU and in EU member states, they really understand this important tension, and their goal really is to get to a place where they are normalizing those responsible practices, but also enabling innovation and competitiveness.
Thank you, Will. So we have a few, I guess we have a few more minutes left because we started a few minutes late. So I see there's one question here in the audience. Yes, Scott.
Hello, Scott Marcus, Bruegel. So actually I had a couple of bits. I wanted to touch a bit about social partners, trade unions. This was a topic that MEP Benefit touched on, and also Katja in one of her remarks. I also wanted to come back to this question of polarization. Now, in a lot of these, there are different themes that are kind of intertwined. Artificial intelligence, gig work, and work from home are all emerging trends, and they're not the same, but they kind of have some crossovers between them. On this issue of social partners or trade unions, clearly trade unions could be playing a much stronger role, one would think, in trying to protect workers from exploitative surveillance or other kinds of harm. But trade union membership has been declining in almost all developed countries for decades. And yet today we have labor shortages in the United States, in most European member states, where trade unions seem like they might be making a resurgence. You know, my fundamental question is, what could be done to strengthen the role? As a related question, in Europe, we've had an important debate because gig workers and other self-employed usually can't unionize because for them to join forces is viewed as a violation of competition law. If they're independent entrepreneurs, it would be seen as really in restraint of trade. There's an effort to deal with that through a proposed directive for gig workers, but it seems to me that it's in principle a broader question. It really relates to all self-employed in principle. Plus you have the additional question, are workers properly classified as self-employed in the first place? So again, sort of a cluster of questions here that relate to how do we make trade unions, social partners more effective in their defense against abusive practices. I wanted to also come back to the point that Du Yu raised earlier about polarization, but here not so much polarization between countries, but rather within them. For work from home, there's an emerging body of survey research that would tend to show, first there's the risk that work from home tends to amplify superstar effects, thus increasing polarization among workers. Clearly, work from home benefits most those that have well-developed skills to do work from home, computer skills, ICT skills. But there's also impact based on either sexuality or gender. The survey results suggest that while women have, in many cases, benefited from the ability to work from home where they might not have been able to before, that those with caregiving responsibilities were very much disadvantaged, especially during the early days of the pandemic where they often had school-aged children at home. But many of these effects, I think, cut across several of these different categories. And so a question I'd toss out is really what more can be done there. Finally, one very quick observation. a lot of the discussion has talked about the difference between AI that eliminates jobs versus AI that complements jobs, but that tends to focus, I think, on existing jobs. There's also a tremendous possibility to create new jobs through new sectors. And in fact, most of the research I see suggests that that's pretty nearly in balance with the job elimination. Still implies, of course, huge issues for those who need to make transformations. Anyway, with that, so I've given you a few things to chew on, I hope.
Excellent question, Scott. Thank you. So since we're running over time, maybe just pick one of his three questions. So either the social partners, polarization, or replace, enable, create new industries. Maybe one, each of you can pick one, and then we'll wrap up the session.
All right, these are excellent questions. Thank you very much. Social partners, definitely my favorite topic. I think really, really important. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, I think, because to have them be more effective at protecting against some of the unfavorable impacts of technology and bringing along very favorable impacts, union membership needs to increase. At the same time, it could increase thanks to, in part at least, unions building capacity around managing and negotiating over these technological issues, because at scale it's really hard for workers, all of them, to invest time to dig into these issues, and really know, what to ask for, what to look for, what kinds of, maybe hidden impacts that ex ante are not so clear, they should be looking out for. And unions, I'm seeing them, especially in Europe, actually being more and more interested in these questions and building capacity around this. And I hope that that can be one of the additional, selling points for more members to join unions. The only message I would kind of want to leave them with is, for too long, it's been a little bit of maybe actually artificially raised barrier that to talk about AI and emerging technologies with management, you need to be a computer scientist or have a degree in AI. No. As unions, you're experts in workers, in their interest, in what makes their jobs better or worse, and that voice is very much needed in the conversation about both designing of AI, which Will was talking about, and this worker-centric design, and decisions around how to deploy it for what, and what safeguards to introduce. So some of these, undesirable impacts, especially around surveillance, do not take place.
Excellent, thank you. Will, maybe also one of the questions on social partners, polarization, or the creation of entirely new industries?
Yeah, I think actually the latter two questions in some ways are complementary. I think it's a great point about the incredible potential of AI to create new jobs, create new opportunities, create new industries. We are seeing that around the world, and importantly, it's not just. I think there's a perception that in the AI economy of the future, the only job will be as a computer programmer. But really, we actually see a lot of new industries and new jobs being created that aren't, actually creating technology, but figuring out how to leverage technology in new ways and to provide new types of services. And so, to me, it really comes down at the end of the day to the critical thinking and the creativity that humans bring to the table that is really difficult, if not impossible, to automate away or replace with technology. I think long-term, that's where the opportunity is going to be for people. And that's where I think, at the end of the day, in addition to technology education and technology literacy, which is really important, but should be focused more on giving people the skills and understanding to actually interact with technology effectively, more so than to necessarily create technology. But it's also about making sure that we continue to invest in the liberal arts, continue to invest in those creativity building, critical thinking oriented approaches to education, to skill creation, because that's going to be the long-term human value add. And that's where we see a lot of new opportunities being created. But to the point about the impact of remote work, and particularly the impact on the way people work, and the polarization, even, for example, between caregivers and non-caregivers and remote work, I think this also gets to an opportunity for technology. How can we develop technologies that help people to balance their responsibilities at home and at work particularly when they're working at home. How do we give people opportunities through technology to have their kids both have really rich interactions with technology, gain new skills and opportunities while they're being educated from home and while they're at home with their parents? But also, how do we figure out how to use technology to enable those parents to effectively engage with their kids and take care of them while also being productive at work and having the time and the focus to do that? Technology, I think, has the potential to help us to address some of these problems and to bridge some of these gaps. And so, to me, it comes down to how do we start to think about these problems from a technology design perspective? How do we bring this to an engineer and say, what comes to your mind when you think about a product that could help to address these challenges, and how do we start to get that thinking pushed forward so that workers who are trying to balance these competing responsibilities, that have different levels of access to these jobs, to remote work, how do we think about products that help to bridge those gaps and make sure that those opportunities are accessible to everyone?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Will. Let's end on this more positive note of technology solving our problems instead of creating new problems. I want to thank both of these speakers for being here with me today, and also you here in the audience, both live and in the online. So I hope you enjoy the rest of our annual meetings, and the next session is at 4:30 downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.